This video, I want to start talking about how we can solve quadratic equations. And the first ones I want to start looking at is if a times b equals 0, then either a equals 0 or b equals 0. Now you can think of these as just numbers. So if you multiply these two numbers together and it equals 0, then one of these had to be 0. But you can also think of these as expressions. Okay, so if a, the expression, times b, the expression, equals 0, then one of those must equal 0. And here I want to look at an example where a and b are expressions. So either x equals 0 or x minus 8 equals 0. Well, if x minus 8 equals 0, then x equals 8. Okay, so the two answers that we're getting is x equals 8 and x equals 0. So there's actually two answers. And you can see that if you plug that back in, x equals 0, this will go to 0. And if you plug in 8, x equals 0. So actually the answer is two numbers, 0 and 8. All right, let's look at the next example. X minus 2 times x minus 3 equals 0. Well, if they equal 0, then either one of those could equal 0. So x minus 2 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. Well, if x minus 2 equals 0, I can add 2, and x equals 2, or I can add 3, and x equals 3. And you can see that if you plugged in x equaled 2 here and here, that this will equal 0. And if you plug in 3 and 3, that this will equal 0. So x equals 2 and 3. Both of those are applicable to the answer. Now, let's look at this example. We have x squared minus 1 equals 0. This x squared minus 1, well, that looks like a difference of squares to me. So I can write that as x plus 1, x minus 1 equals 0. Okay, so I changed the left-hand side by factoring, and then now I'm able to find what this equals. So it looks like x plus 1 equals 0, or x minus 1, let me go back. X minus 1 equals 0. Well, if I subtract 1 on both sides, I get x equals negative 1. And if I add 1 to both sides, I get x equals 1. So that means that x equals negative 1 and 1, and that would be the solution to that problem. Two different numbers. All right, let's look at this another example. X squared minus 3x minus 10. Well, if I can, I want to factor the left-hand side, and it looks like this is a leading coefficient of 1 problem, and so I need to find the factors of negative 10, which would add to negative 3. Well, the factors of 10 are obviously 1 and 10, and 5 and 2. I want it to add to negative 3, so it looks like negative 5 would work. All right, well, that means it's x minus 5, x plus 2 equals 0. And one of these has to be 0, or both have to be 0, so x minus 5 equals 0, or x plus 2 equals 0. And that means that x equals negative 2, 5. And so now we can start seeing that you just switch the signs. So that would be the solution to that one. All right, let's look at this next example. X squared plus 9x plus 8. Well, if we can, we want to factor. Again, this looks like it's a leading coefficient of 1 problem, so I have to find the factors of 8, which would add to 9. I think 8 and 1 would work for me. So I'm going to say x plus 1, x plus 8, and that equals 0. So then x plus 1 equals 0, or x plus 8 equals 0. So it looks like it looks like it equals negative 8 and negative 1. Okay. Not too bad, not too bad. Now, this one is kind of annoying because look at this. We have x times x minus 4, but it doesn't equal 0. This is not a 0. So I'm going to have to come up with some other way to do it. So I'm going to distribute and see what I get. So I get x squared minus 4x equals 77. And I can bring that 77 to the left-hand side. X squared minus 4x minus 77 equals 0. Now, this is a leading coefficient of one problem, so I need to think of what are the factors of negative 77 which would add to 4. I'm thinking 7 and 11 have a difference of 4. If I make the larger number negative, then they'll add negative. So that looks like that will work. So I can say x minus 11, x plus 7 equals 0. And that means that x minus 11 equals 0, or x plus 7 equals 0. And so if you add 11 to both sides, you're going to get positive 11. If you subtract 7 on both sides, you get negative 7. So negative 7, 11 there. There we go. Okay, so that would be the two solutions to our problem. And that's not too bad, is it? I mean, we have to kind of remember some factoring techniques. So maybe it's a good excuse to review those, but it's really not that bad. Looks like we have a few more minutes to do a couple more problems. So I have x squared minus 25 equals 0. Now this is the difference of squares again, so I can write x plus 5, x minus 5 equals 0. And so it looks like x equals negative 5 and 5, okay? And that's coming from the previous examples, the way we did them before. However, I want to show you this. If we add 25 to both sides, we can actually take the square root of both sides, right? Square root of both sides. Now I have to write plus or minus when you take the square root of both sides. You have to write plus or minus. But look at that. It's going to become x equals plus or minus 5. And that's exactly what we're finding with the other method. So both methods are getting the same answer. So that's most likely working out for us. Okay. Let's look at another example. I have x squared minus 1 equals 0. Again, this looks like a difference of squares to me. So because this is a difference of squares, I can write this as x plus 1, x minus 1 equals 0. And so that looks like it'd be x equals negative 1 and 1. But I can also use the other method where I add 1 to both sides. So I get x equals 1. That implies that if you take the square root of both sides, I have to write that plus or minus when I write the square root of both sides. But the square root of 1 is just 1, so I get x equals plus or minus 1. And both of those are the same answer, right? We're getting equivalent statements. So that's awesome. That's really helpful. Now, the next one is going to utilize that we just found out, the fact that we can take the square root of both sides. So that's how I'm going to solve a problem like this. I'm not going to distribute it. I have a square equals a number. I'm going to take the square of both sides, square root of both sides. So the square root of x plus 8 squared equals plus or minus the square root of 16. And so that means that x plus 8 equals plus or minus 4. I can subtract both sides by 8. X equals negative 8 plus or minus 4. So x equals negative 8 minus 4. And x equals negative 8 plus 4. And I can rewrite those as negative 12. And I can write that as negative 4. And so I can solve it in that way. Well, that's going to do it for this video, but I hope that's helpful. You can probably guess how we're going to do the next one in the next video. But yeah, hopefully that will give you a head start of how you can start solving these quadratic equations.